Hey, what's going on, my friends? We've got an exciting one today, a comparison between the a6000 and the brand new a6700. Now, I want to talk about the differences and obviously what has happened during, 2014 when this released, and obviously almost 10 years later, the a6700. Like, is there a massive difference between these two cameras? And you have to think, obviously, there is a massive difference. Like, they've only really had 3 different sensors when it comes to the APS-C cameras over the 10 years. Like, they seem to, keep the same sensor and reuse them in different bodies, and obviously add different firmware, software, add different hardware. And this is pretty much what ARRI did with their sensor in the ARRI Alexa. They pretty much just used that sensor for 10 years and then finally just upgraded a couple of years ago. And look, I know there's a lot of people out there with the a6000 and they're probably thinking, should I go this a6700? And hopefully we'll answer that in this video. But how far has the a6700 come from the a6000? Let's talk about it. So the a6000 has a 24 megapixel sensor, it has a 921,000 dot tilt screen, has a Bion's X processor, a 1.4 million dot EVF, has the ability to record 1080p at 60 frames per second, can do 11 frames per second in burst mode, and has a smaller W50 battery. The a6700 is a 26 megapixel BSI CMOS sensor, it has a 1.3 million dot flip screen, has the Bion's XR processor and also an AI processor, has a 2.36 million dot EVF, the ability to record 4K at 60 frames per second and 4K 120 frames per second in a crop. And it has the larger Z100 battery. So right from the bat, we obviously have to talk about the clear and physical differences. The a6700 is thicker and people are actually preferring the slightly bigger body, but still nice, small and compact. This one does have a thicker grip, and for the biggest reason, it has that Z100 battery, but a lot of people like that thicker grip because it actually does feel nice in the hands, whereas the a6000, you kind of had to add a cage onto it to really give it some girth and have the ability to hold it correctly. But this one has that super small W50 batteries. I mean, look how small this battery is. It barely gave you any record times whatsoever. But in terms of record times, like, this can only do 1080p at 60 frames per second. So that really isn't good. This was kind of before the time of cameras having a standard 4K sensor. So this only has 1080p, 60 frames per second, whereas the new one, you can do 4K at 60 frames per second in the full Super 35 mode. And then you can actually do 4K at 120 frames per second with almost like a 1.5 crop. So it's almost like a Super 16 sort of crop. So that is a massive difference between these two cameras. And when it comes to the 1080p, this can do 1080p up to 240 frames per second. That is massive. And the biggest difference that I like between these two cameras when it comes to video is 10-bit 422. That is an absolute game changer. Now, when it comes to game changer, I think 8-bit to 10-bit is actually a game changer. When it comes to color grading, when it comes to bit depth, skin tones, all those kind of things, it just makes color grading so much better. Colors look more accurate, more vibrant. Your film literally looks different because of the colors. And 10-bit is amazing. It gives you just over 1 billion different colors to work with, as opposed to 16 million colors in the 8-bit codec. Now, this one does have the stronger codec as well, the XAVC-SI, so it's got the all-lie codec as opposed to just your regular XAVC-S. And you also do have the ability to do XAVC-HS, which is a compressed H.265, which keeps the image quality as well. Now, we do have a massive difference when it comes to color reproduction because the a6700 has 10-bit, whereas the a6000 has 8-bit. But also the a6700 allows for picture profiles. So you have a ton of picture profiles to choose from, and with the popular likes of S-Cinetone, which is pretty much your ready to go straight out of camera, or you can film in S-Log3 as well through flexible ISO. And the a6000 doesn't have any picture profiles, but you can kind of change the color tone and adjust the sharpness, saturation, and contrast. Now, also with image quality, there is a higher dynamic range in these a6700. So essentially dynamic range, you can capture more of the highlights and shadows, and it just gives you more information to play with. Whereas the a6000 does clip a lot sooner. So it is more difficult when you run and gun and you're trying to get the talent exposed. You may blow out the skies. Now, a very welcomed feature is that front dial on the a6700, and this is the first a6000 range camera that has actually got this, which gives you the ability to control your aperture through the front dial, just like the full frame lenses. And obviously the a6000 does not have this. Now, one of the biggest things that I love about this a6700 happens to be that hybrid switch. Now, this thing is incredible when it comes to photography and videography, because obviously if you throw it into video mode and you have all your settings, you can throw it over to photo mode, and all your settings are completely saved from when you had it before. So you can have completely different settings, quickly hit that switch, and you're into video mode and it goes to those video settings. Now, also another sort of major design difference between this camera and the a6000 happens to be that flip screen. Whereas, the a6000 could only flip up and kind of sort of flip down. So it was quite useful. But if you do shoot any sort of vertical shots, you're kind of stuck. And if you're doing low vertical shots, you really are stuck. Whereas this one, flips out and obviously flips forward. So you can see yourself if you're recording. But obviously if you are in portrait mode, you can obviously hold it sideways and still see with, holding it nice and low. You can go up above, you can go down low. There's so many different ways you can actually utilize this screen. And I do think it is massive. And they did bring back the touch screen as well. So this has full touch functionality, whereas the a6000 doesn't have touch functionality. Now, when it comes to the ports, they still have stuck with that single SD card slot in both of them, but this one can accept the UHS 2 cards. And I think one of the biggest things as well, it happens to come down to the microphone jack and the headphone jack. Now, the only other small difference between the body is that the a6700 does have that multi-interface hot shoe, so you can connect the brand new Sony microphones on top, which are incredible. I absolutely love them. And even if you put the audio onto auto, they do an incredible job. There's absolutely no cords that you have to plug into the side. Literally just powers it and brings the audio directly through the multi-interface hot shoe. And while the a6000 doesn't accept absolutely all the Sony microphones, it does actually accept the ECM G1, which is the small microphone. And this is pretty much the only way you're going to be able to get audio directly through this hot shoe. And this one has a micro HDMI, so you can't actually stream with this unless you have like a completely separate streaming device. Whereas this one, you can plug it through direct USB-C and stream 4K 30, no problems. Okay, now the funny thing is, when it comes to the back screen, the a6000 is only a 921,000 dot back screen. This one is only a $1.03 million back screen, so the screens haven't really changed, and it just goes to show that Sony really don't prioritize the back screen, and they don't think it's worth, giving you the highest quality screens. Even though Sony are very well known for having good OLED screens, there just isn't a really good OLED screen in the back. But hey, you're not watching films on the back of the screen, so all you need these screens for is literally to compose your shot, making sure it's in focus, and you're pretty much sweet. And it's kind of the same with the EVF. Like, this is a $1.44 million EVF, and they've only gone up to $2.36 million EVF. So it hasn't really changed too much, but it's still enough. Like, it's one of those things where you don't really need a crazy high resolution EVF. It's only enough to at least get the shot, and that's pretty much all you need. It really just depends. Do you want a more expensive camera, or do you want to cut back on some of the features and have a much cheaper camera? Now, one of the clear differences between the sensors is that this is just a 24 megapixel sensor, whereas this is a 26 megapixel sensor, but that sensor moves. So it has IBIS, and that can be a massive difference between these two cameras. This has no IBIS and no active stability. This has got IBIS, active stability, and obviously it works incredibly well, and you do obviously have that gyro data as well. So when it comes to stability, if you don't have stabilized lenses and you pair it with the a6000, you've got no stability, and that can be a pretty big determining factor. If you're going to be using this for video or photo, you could have shaky shots and it doesn't look professional at all. Whereas, having that IBIS is just enough to get rid of all those micro jitters and at least make your videos look a lot more professional. So now one big thing about the processor in this is it gives the ability to have so many more internal features with variable shutter, it's got focus bracketing, it's got auto reframing, which is incredible. You've got time-lapse internal as well. You've also got screen reader, which I don't think anyone uses, but it's there if you do need it. And obviously the brand new Sony menu as well. So the higher processor just gives the ability to have so many more internal features, which is a massive difference. And it becomes down to, just the workflow and the usability of this camera as opposed to the a6000. There is another massive reason why you might choose the a6700 over the a6000, and that happens to come down to the autofocus system. Because of that AI chip, you have a much faster autofocus system, more objects that you can track with planes, trains, cars. It just is so much more responsive than the a6000. But the a6000 is no absolute slouch. It still does okay when it comes to video, but when it comes to photos, obviously there is a massive difference there as well. The funny thing is the a6000 actually does win in one category, and that is the flash. Most photographers will not ever use on-camera flash like this. They will have an external flash either attached into the hot shoe, or it will be slaved directly through a softbox to give you nice soft flash. Now, what about when it comes to photos? This is where things get a little bit interesting because the a6000 actually has a fairly decent sensor. It's a 24 megapixel sensor, whereas the a6700 is a 26 megapixel sensor. And they look pretty similar. The a6000, sure, the colors are a little bit different. The usability when it comes to autofocus is when the a6700 is better because it has better eye autofocus. But overall, if you know how to take some decent photos, these cameras could be pretty difficult to tell the difference between these two. So overall, look, there's a pretty clear difference between the a6700 and the a6000 when it comes to dynamic range, the color, the flexibility you have in post-production, obviously 4K over 1080p, but look, if you light both of these cameras quite well, expose them quite well, you could actually get really good images out of the a6000 when it comes to video and also photo as well. So it really comes down to just learning how to utilize these tools and getting the most out of the camera you're actually using. But obviously the a6700 pretty much beats the a6000 in every single category, as opposed to that on-camera flash. But it really just comes down to which camera you actually need, or, do you feel like you need to upgrade to a full frame camera instead? So there's so many things to think about, but hopefully this video helped you guys in making a decision whether you're going to be upgrading to the a6700 or something else. But anyway, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. That would be absolutely amazing. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and the link will be in the description below if you do want to check out my grading LUTs. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.